What keeps you awake at night?
Sea levels are rising globally.
Fears fueled by horror stories.
Among the worst flu season in a decade, and it hasn't peaked yet.
We all know the atomic bomb is very dangerous.
Another series of deadly terror attacks.
Because you know that thing your brain does in the middle of the night? This crazy thing where it takes a small problem and it just makes it enormous?
There is somebody that contracted measles, which, if I recall correctly, measles is asymptomatic for the time that it's infectious, and then you get, the actual symptoms, and if you cough, it's an airborne pathogen.
See, that's so bitchy. That's, insane to me. They just design themselves so that you don't know about it, and then you're passing the disease? Can't be while you're sick. God.
Ain't that wild?
Bastard.
If it makes you feel any more comfortable, and it did not make me feel more comfortable, if you were to cough on your hand and you had measles and were infectious, and then touch a surface, the virus particles would be on that surface for 3 days.
3 days, did you say?
Three days. Now, why is this being discussed? And this isn't our epidemic episode, so I do think we will probably do another series on that, considering my fears have come to fruition.
Yeah.
Someone at UCLA contracted measles and walked into, I think they were like a South Campus major, which is where I am, sick, and they went into they went to Bolter Hall and the Mathematical Sciences building, and everybody who was in immediate contact with them and everybody who was in that building was interviewed, and anybody that didn't have their MMR vaccine up to date, which is the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, is put on quarantine. And so I guess this extended beyond, because there are teachers and faculty that also teach at Cal State LA.
Oh boy.
So,
including
UCLA and Cal State LA, there are currently 900 people on quarantine.
Now, when you say quarantine, do you mean they just have to stay home, or?
No. I think they're in the hospital. Quarantine area in the hospital, cannot leave, being monitored for symptoms. These are people that either were not vaccinated or cannot prove their MMR vaccination, right? So if you were interviewed and you were like, no, I got my measles vaccine, and I got my measles vaccine 6 months ago when I transferred to UCLA,
right,
you're fine. They're going to release you. It's a very, very effective vaccine. But anybody that wasn't, or anybody that couldn't prove it, they're all on quarantine lockdown.
Gosh, I don't know if I would be able to, because I know that I'm up to date on my MMR, but I don't know if I would be able to produce the document, right? I don't know where that is.
Yeah, that's the issue, is I only know where it is because I had to get it all prepared when I transferred, so it's all up and ready to go.
Oh, yeah.
My mom had saved my vaccination record when I was an infant.
Yes.
So she has it on hand. And my friend Hannah's like, man, I wish my mother had the wherewithal to do that, because when she transferred to UCLA, she's like, hey, did you save my vaccination record? And mom's like, why would I save that? She's like, all right, sick. So she had to do a ton of I guess you can do blood tests for antibodies. And as long as you have the antibodies present, it means that you've been vaccinated for it.
That sounds expensive.
Yeah, I don't remember if it was covered or not, but that's what you have to do if you don't have your vaccination records. I don't know if that is, I don't know if that's fine for confirming this, because if you have antibodies there for it, it could mean that you're infected.
Yeah, you could just have measles. Yikes.
Yeah. So
that
anyway, that's
awesome.
A new fear that I have, and everybody's pissed, and the meme pages are relentless, which I think is more than fair.
No, yeah, I'm cool with that. That makes sense to me.
Yeah. So,
Jesus.
What an opener.
Get your goddamn vaccines.
Please, for the love of God. We're gonna have another series on epidemics, I assume. And I'm sure we're gonna be twice as angry as the first time.
Because it's gotten worse. The anti-vaxxers have gotten worse. Did you hear about the potato thing?
No.
Oh my God. So
no.
I'm convinced that this was someone who's for vaccinations that went and infiltrated, Yeah. So there's this post that went around, and it was someone who was like, Everybody, you can get your vaccines. Just put a raw potato that's been peeled up against the injection site, and it will extract all of the poison and toxins, and then you can have the benefit of the vaccination. And at this point, Olivia, I don't care about the pseudoscience. If this is what will get anti-vaxxers to vaccinate their fucking children, I am all for the potato bullshit.
Now, it doesn't have to be an organic potato.
Shit.
Did you even read about that? Did you even, care to do the extra research before you brought it onto this podcast?
You're right. I am a perpetuator of pseudoscience.
Oh, yeah. So that's my fear. My name is Olivia.
Hi, I'm Brooke.
And this is Things That Keep Me Up at Night. I'm really new season, new us. We're fucking actually doing the intro.
Isn't that something?
Yeah. And today we're actually not Jesus. We're actually not discussing vaccines.
Yeah. That's later.
That's later.
If you are interested in our talk about anti-vaxxers, we have a really cool episode with Ross Blotcher of Oh No, Ross and Carrie. Check that out. Look at me plugging our old episodes.
Oh, hell yeah. Today we're continuing our series on
modern slavery.
Yes. Now, I had a horrible time researching mine. It made me so angry.
Yeah.
If you listen to my episode, the amount of times that I had to edit out me going, just because I didn't even know how to proceed. It was so obnoxious. It is my new habit now. I'm consciously going out of my ways to not
Yeah, I love listening back / hate listening back to the episodes because it stands out like a sore thumb to me. I know that the people I've talked to say that it's not a big deal, but it just drives me insane.
Oh, you know what else that I do apparently that drives me insane is while anybody else is talking, I go, yeah.
You're active listening.
And that's nice, but holy shit, was it obnoxious when I was editing it. And it got to a point where I dedicated a good 30 minutes just going back in and seeing through the audio files and looking for peaks where I was not talking, because I assumed that's when I was saying and just cutting a lot of it because it was so obnoxious when you were having your own moment and you just hear my dumb ass going, yeah.
I do that too, though.
I know. But yeah, I guess it's different when you're editing. You're like, why did I keep fucking doing that?
Shut the fuck up, you stupid whore.
We're completely fucked if we do a live episode.
Oh no.
And it just immediately switches to me going, yeah. And then jokes just fucking crash landing like a kamikaze plane in front of
Olivia.
hundreds of people. Anyway,
Jesus.
that's my fear. How do we relate this to slavery? Now, Brooke.
Leave that segue to me, I guess. We've had a time with modern slavery. Actually, I finished researching yesterday. I should stop doing that. But
you sent me a text at 12:30 in the morning, and it said, "We doing 10?" It's like, oh baby,
yikes. It's fine. It's whatever. So I finished researching, and I actually talked to my dad briefly, and I just yelled for 10 minutes about what I had found out, because it's just, you wouldn't think that it could get that insane, but here we are.
Oh no.
So
please don't be palm oil. Please don't be palm oil. Please don't be palm oil.
I'm not going to talk about palm oil, Olivia.
Oh, thank God.
Yeah, I'm not going to ruin Nutella for you. Although Nutella is ethically sourced, I've heard.
Yeah, we interacted with Nutella on Twitter, and I looked it up, and they ethically source their Nutella, and that made me incredibly happy.
Yay, so I can clog my bloodstream full of chocolate hazelnut and feel okay about it.
Yeah.
So, this far, we have talked about modern slavery in the sense that people are trapped into jobs that don't pay enough to survive, and then they sort of become a cog in a system that they can't escape, and there's no ethical consumption under capitalism, and that's bad enough. But what if I told you that today we're going to talk about how it's not just a metaphor of slavery or an iteration of slavery. What if I told you we were just going to talk about straight up slavery? in the sense that everybody thinks of it. What if I told you, Olivia Leland, that slavery is legal in the United States? Honest to God, actual slavery in the same terms as before the Emancipation Proclamation.
What?
And what if I told you that the exact same legal action that abolished slavery in the United States is the same one that legalized it?
Oh no, I don't like whatever we're going to be talking about. I don't like your attitude. It makes me very nervous.
All right. Yeah, you should be. We are talking about the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution.
Oh.
Now, this actually got a lot of heat in the last few years, which is so excellent, but I still don't hear people talking about it, like, widespread. I hear a lot of my friends and family members cite the 13th Amendment as the end of slavery as a whole, which is true, but also it's a complete lie.
Oh no.
So, I'm going to quote the amendment directly. Our Constitution says, and I quote, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction."
I know where this is going, and I'm ready to not have a good time.
So there's a weird clause in there, isn't there like a pretty blatant exception to the whole slavery is bad thing? You know, the one where it says that slavery is perfectly legal as long as the person being enslaved committed a crime. Interesting! So, I think we're clear here. We're going to be talking about the prison system. That's what we're talking about now. We're talking about prison labor. I am already angry, as you could perhaps tell. I'm going to back up a little, because I think there are a few things that are important to clarify. First and foremost, a lot of people think that the Emancipation Proclamation freed all slaves in the U.S. in 1862. Strictly speaking, and also legally speaking, this isn't the case at all. The Emancipation Proclamation only applied to the 11 Confederate states that were at war with the Union during the Civil War. These were Alabama, North and South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, Arkansas, and Tennessee, just for reference sake, so we know what we're talking about. Moreover, the proclamation only applied to those territories that weren't already under Union control. The implication was that Union-controlled states would follow suit, but the document itself only applies to those specific territories. It also meant absolutely nothing in practice without a constitutional amendment. So when Lincoln got up on the podium and started talking about how all the slaves were free, that didn't mean jack shit.
Oh boy.
Just so you guys know.
Also, for the non-U.S. listeners out there, all of the states she just listed, imagine like if America was split in half, east and west, it'd be the south half of that. Just found out pretty recently that our state system is pretty ambiguous to Europe.
Yeah.
The other day I told Hassan, I said, yeah, I'd love to go to Johns Hopkins University. And he said, oh, where is that? And I was like, oh, it's Baltimore. And he's like, where? And I was like, Maryland. And he's like, I don't know where that is. And I was like, I don't know. It's in Maryland. And he's like, yeah, but what state? And I'm like,
Maryland.
Hassan, Maryland is the state. And he said, how am I supposed to know where that is? And I'm like, I don't.
Yeah, I guess other countries don't have to memorize the U.S. map.
With a song, da-da-da.
Let's just sing all of it right now. Yeah, that makes sense. So it would be on the east coast of the United States, southern territories.
Yeah,
so,
like the southeast quadrant of the U.S., essentially.
Exactly. So this is where lucky number 13 comes in. In 1864, the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery was passed with a 2/3 majority in the Senate, but it collapsed in the House of Representatives because more Democrats were just like hardening their stance in favor of slavery because there was an upcoming election. And I want to take another segue here to clarify something else before we go on. I said that Democrats supported slavery, but it is so important to me that you understand that the Democratic and Republican parties basically switched platforms somewhere between 1860 and 1936. Yes. Both parties wanted to vie for votes in the West. And gradually, the priorities of their parties completely switched. So don't at me on Twitter and be like, "Wow, Democrats are evil and wanted slavery." Like, come on, pals, we're better than this.
Also, for clarification, if I recall correctly, and hopefully my U.S. history teacher isn't listening to this because I will make her weep.
Yikes.
The House of Representatives has a different number of representatives with respect to the population. So if I recall, at the time period, the Democrats were essentially in control of the House of Representatives because of the quote-unquote amount of, like, population in the South.
Right.
Whereas the other house, which is called the Senate,
Yeah.
wonderful, is everybody has, like, a fixed amount of representatives there.
Yeah, it's like
every
a
state has
fixed thing.
2,
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
So that was, I think, the North led. So essentially, like, one house was primarily led by the South, one house from the North.
Right. Which is kind of what's happening now. And we could go into politics if we wanted to, but I just wanted to make it clear before I got, like, angry tweets. Democrats and Republicans are kind of the opposite of how we envision them now, with some variation. So back to the 13th Amendment. Lincoln was reelected, and the Republicans put the pressure on Democrats to change their votes, and it worked, and the 13th Amendment was passed with pretty difficult responses. The South was not happy. Now, just as a moment of analysis, tell me, Olivia, does the 13th Amendment specify what kind of crime constitutes slavery as a punishment?
No, it does not.
No, it does not. That's super interesting. Anyway, now we're going to move into the Reconstruction era. The idea, as I'm sure you can figure out this was right after the Civil War, was to rebuild the United States after the destruction of the Civil War, and also with a new population of millions of disenfranchised but newly free black people. The U.S. had no idea what to do with just this brand new landscape, politically and socially, and to the surprise of absolutely no one, 9 of the 11 Confederate states were the first to begin leasing out their prisoners from 1866 to 1872. Legally speaking, anyone convicted of a crime and imprisoned could be leased to private corporations that had zero legal precedent to take care of the prisoners. None of the generally accepted benefits associated with, work all of them were just completely put aside for prison workers. No health care, no meals, no clothing, no pay. This essentially allowed the states to recreate a social system in which black people were redirected right back into slavery, where white people had the ability to control their lives based on the desire for free labor. They could just do whatever they wanted, basically. So the southern states also passed a series of laws between 1865 and 1866 called the Black Codes. And I feel like that maybe speaks for itself, but just in case it doesn't, these essentially amounted to restricting freedom for black people, period. That's all that the entire goal was. And actually, the northern states adopted their own versions of this as well, just to, they wanted to dissuade black people from buying land in the north, so they just put all these crazy restrictions on land ownership. And so they had their own version of this. In the south, it varied state to state, but most of them included restriction on the right to own property, how to conduct business, whether they could buy or lease land, or just kind of exist in public spaces. So, yeah, we're feeling good, right, guys? One particularly insidious law involved criminalizing black people who were out of work, or, more specifically, who didn't work jobs that white people approved. I wish I could say that that's an exaggeration. It's just not. If a white person didn't recognize the job that a black person was doing, they could just say that it didn't count. They forced black people to sign yearly labor contracts, which essentially forced them into working jobs where there was little to no pay. Because they were forced to work, then the employers could pay whatever they wanted. If they refused, then they were arrested and then imprisoned for vagrancy, and then funneled right back into the penal labor system. In fact, any black person who was found guilty of any crime based on their really purposefully vague vagrancy laws would immediately be convicted and made into a slave all over again.
Woof. You know what this reminds me of? This reminds me of our Venezuela episode where one of the presidents illegalized vagrancy.
Isn't that something?
Which was just a funnel system to
Yep.
create
Free labor. Yeah.
to create labor. Yeah. Continue.
So, a journalist named Douglas A. Blackman says he called it, quote, slavery by another name, which is actually the title of his book. I would argue that he is vastly understating it. It is just slavery. It is the same thing as it always was, and it's in our goddamn Constitution. Just as an interesting anecdote, just that puts a button on the point, Southern states didn't build any penitentiaries until the late 19th century. They didn't need to, because all their prisoners were being leased to private corporations.
Oh.
In 1898, 73% of Alabama's state revenue came from prison leasing.
No.
Yeah, it's so much worse than you think it is. So now it's about the time when states began tapering off prisoner leasing. It was, state by state, they were finding that it was less and less effective, just cost-wise, and they were replacing it with what you probably would think of as a cartoonish stereotype of prison, where prisoners were put into chain gangs to work exhausting manual labor inside the prison. So instead of leasing them out, they were just building institutions where they could do the work like directly for the prison and make money, just cutting out the middleman, essentially.
Great.
So, yeah, great. Perfect. This was also about the time where, like, real prisons were being built and I say real prisons, in the way that we think of them. With the express intention of putting inmates to work doing manual labor, farm work, textile work, etc., etc. Nowadays, they do, like, circuit board work, which sounds very dangerous to me, but what do I know? So, this is where the episode gets dicey, because we're talking about a practice that hasn't just been major events and then a compelling conclusion. We're talking about something that is still happening, and happened continuously since the 13th Amendment was ratified. So there's no way for me to go into this in the detail that it deserves without talking for fucking 8 hours about specific events. So I'm just gonna give you some highlights that blew my mind while researching. And I want just everybody to know who's listening, for background, these are the highlights, but every single year in American history has statistics like this. There is no one standout state or era that changed the way things were done in any meaningful way. Just so we're clear. So here we go. You okay over there?
I'm just trying to take it all in, buddy, because when I was in my neoliberalism class, we went over debtors' prisons for like 2 days. So I'm anticipating the worst.
Yeah. You should. So in 1901, Mississippi created Parchman Farms, which is a prison institution originally intended only for black inmates. Period. That prison eventually became Mississippi State Penitentiary. I struggle with that word. And
I thought it was penitentiary.
Penitentiary. It probably is. You've heard how I've been saying it this whole time. It's just...
Tweet us. We'll do a poll. How do you pronounce it? Penitentiary, penitentiary. Those are the two options. I can't think of another.
Yeah, it's just those two. So eventually it became Mississippi State. In the first full year of Operation Parchman Farms reported $185,000 in total income from prison labor and operations alone. Now, how much do you think that is equal to today?
Is it in the millions?
Yes.
Is it in the high millions?
Just give me your best guess.
20 millions.
You're shooting high, but that you're going for the right ballpark. In 1901, $185,000 was the equivalent of over $5.6 million today.
Shit.
That was 1 year.
Oh, one or all of them?
One year of one state penitentiary.
Oh, okay. I was doing like collectively what they would.
No, just
one.
Just
Wow.
Parchman Farm.
That's a lot for one. That's
$5.6 million today.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, another cool point of reference about Parchman Farms is that it was basically just a recreation of the fields where slaves would have been put to work before slavery had been abolished. Abolished is in quotes in my notes, just so you're clear.
I would like to imagine that they have a Southern style like plantation.
Pretty much.
And they're like, we have news that slavery's just been abolished, and the owner kind of looks around and he just walks up to the plantation where it says sugar plantation, and then he just like crosses out a few letters and inserts some with some carrots, and it just becomes penitentiary. And he's like, this is good.
Yeah,
this
they
is
just
good.
paint over it. It's fine. No one will notice. That could very well be what they did, because they were so similar that the Mississippi Department of Archives and History actually said it was, quote, in many ways reminiscent of a gigantic antebellum plantation and operated on the basis of a plan proposed by Governor John M. Stone in 1896. It functioned nearly identically, with chain gangs harvesting cotton in the fields all day, while superintendents rode on horseback with shotguns in their hands. It was exactly the same.
How is this allowed?
What do you even mean by that question, Olivia?
I feel like if it's exactly the fucking same, does nobody care enough to be like, hey, why are they just put on hats? And you're like, yeah.
Because it's legal. Like, I think this is the thing that it's such a weird dissonance that slavery was abolished, except when they're criminals. Like, that's literally what the amendment says, is that you can have slaves as long as they commit a crime. That's on the page. It's insane. And you have to look at it and wonder, who let this happen? So this is... I'm getting ahead of myself, but yeah, you're right. At some point, somebody probably was like, hey, this is just slavery. But then everybody pointed back at the Constitution and said, you're right, and it's legal. So, like, what was gonna happen?
And I guess it's also one of those things where, like, how much can politicians, like, point the finger? Because, I mean, like, it's one of those things where I don't agree with it at fucking all, and I think it's disgusting.
Yeah.
But I'm certain there was a fair amount of, like, walking on eggshells, because if they really tried to fix that amendment, then it's going to be Civil War Mark II.
Right. Well, and I don't know. I looked for a long time to see what the drafting process of that amendment was, and there's just nothing, which I guess makes sense. But, like, yeah, it doesn't... I didn't find anything about them fighting over the verbiage or anything like that. So for all we know, they just drafted up that it was legal in the case of criminals, and that was just it. My thought is that it probably was a concession.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It was like, we'll legalize slavery, but you guys can have slaves as long as they're criminals, and I'm sure we're going to get into this later. There's still, to this day, this misconception is the wrong word. This, I guess this feeling that criminals are less than human beings.
Oh yeah, we'll get into it.
So
100%.
Yeah, not to jump ahead, but I'm sure that's kind of what the feeling was even then, which is still an argument that's made today of like, well, once you're arrested, you're less than a person. So
right. Well, I mean, prisoners don't have the right to vote, which, if you think about it logically, is fucking insane.
Yeah.
That's crazy that an entire kind of big deal population of the United States can't vote in public elections. And, like, I understand that there's this cognitive dissonance in society, because, like, the argument that I heard about this was so funny. They were like, well, prisoners are just going to vote themselves out of prison.
What?
And I was like, they
How?
don't have the numbers. They just don't. It's like...
Well, no, don't we have the largest incarcerated population in the world?
We do, but also it's still only, like, 2% of, like, the population of America.
All right,
so they can't, like, vote themselves out. And the response
also,
that I saw to that was...
I don't know if it's like, to a degree, the way in which media has reported this situation or the way it's been conveyed, but I think a lot of people forget that you can be arrested for things that don't make you a bad person.
Right. Nonviolent crimes are some of the most commonly arrested crimes, period. Like,
right? Like, I know that you can be arrested and jailed for not paying child support,
Yeah.
which is shitty, but doesn't mean you shouldn't be able to vote anymore.
Right.
Like, you know what I mean? It's just, like, if you had an amendment there that said rapists and murderers would not be able to vote, I'd be like, I'm inclined to vote for this. But if you have people, it's like, oh yeah, they didn't pay their taxes, or they had too many parking tickets.
Right.
I'm like,
no, that's insane. That's insanity. And like,
so,
we
and
could
I'm
go
sure
back
it varies
and
by
forth.
state, because I think there is like the contingent of if it's like felonious crimes, you can't vote.
Right.
But I think there's even a fair amount of felonious crimes that's like broke into a vehicle.
Right.
Therefore,
yeah.
you can't vote anymore. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
it just doesn't.
And
that
like,
doesn't.
we could go back and forth about the murder and rape thing, and like, rape we don't even need to talk about, but murder, like, there are people that are on death row that murdered, like, for instance, their mother's abuser and were convicted as children and tried as adults. So like,
Yeah.
let's just not touch this. But yeah, it's
Yeah.
insane to me that an entire cross-section of people have just been rubber stamped into not being human, not being citizens anymore. And this is sort of a side effect of that. So, segueing right back in,
Yes.
by 1929, basically every state had outlawed prison leasing and had replaced it with chain gangs, making their income solely via... Okay.
They're like, we're getting rid of it because it's bad, and then you read it and you're like, this is the same thing.
It's the same. It's just the same. And
am
like,
I gonna make
yeah.
that meme about like Pam saying this is the same picture?
You should.
You bet your ass I'm gonna make that meme when this comes out.
Oh god. And it's, yeah, you read it and you realize that none of it was morally motivated. It was entirely financial. They replaced it with chain gangs just to cut out the private corporations so they could make more money. So
For the sake of listeners, can you clarify the difference between the two, at least in a legal sense? I know there's none, but do your
so
best.
prison leasing was essentially just, they would have prisoners in the penal system, private corporations, and I can actually name some today that use prison labor, but it's a different kind of thing because this was back in like the 20s. At the time, they would, sign their workers to private corporations and just send them to them. And they would work for these private corporations, usually agriculture, but we don't have to go into detail. Chain gangs, they would live and work in the prison on specially created facilities, for instance, farms, like parchment farms that I mentioned before, or in a textile factory. And it would be just what you would conceive of as a prison today, but also they were working inside the prison because the facility was created specifically for that. So, yeah, that was how these prisons made income. Inmate slave labor and cutting out the middleman, that it raised profits for them. But something kind of weird happened in 1929. Do you remember what that was?
Depression?
Yeah, that's right. The entire stock market went kerblue, and this thing called the Great Depression happened. And nobody could afford anything ever.
Woo!
Yay! So in response to the Great Depression, something called the Hawes-Cooper Act actually made interstate trade of prison-made goods illegal. This was only because private corporations could no longer compete with prison-free labor, so they all lobbied to make it impossible for prisons to sell across state lines. Speaking from just a market perspective, this is probably a good thing because a market flooded with free labor-made goods is not great for free trade. But, like, I do want to stress that them stopping interstate trade of prison-made goods was not a moral decision. It was just a bunch of private corporations wanting to be able to survive. That was all.
Yeah.
So,
well, that's interesting that you say this too, because this kind of feeds into my thing of like the little stepping stone towards using slavery to yield cheap commodity goods.
Yeah.
Kind of started here in the U.S.
A little bit, yeah. And this was, of course, at a time where like the work couldn't be really shipped abroad the way it is now. But yeah, there were entire populations of disenfranchised people that were that couldn't find any other work, and this is probably where that started. Yeah. So prison-made goods, I want to clarify, were still legally sold and made within each state's borders. Nothing was being done about the slavery itself, just where it could be sold, so it couldn't flood the market. And then FDR happened. Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was, oh god, I forgot the number of his presidency. He was a president, for anybody who isn't a U.S.
He was
person.
elected, I think, during the late Depression.
Yes.
And then extended beyond World War II.
Right.
So, for time-wise, that's what he was at. He served for, I would like to say, what is the equivalent of 3 terms?
Yeah, I think he's
one
the
term
only
in the U.S. is 4 years. So
like
it had to be at least 3.
Yeah. So his whole thing, he has a complicated history, I guess, with society and progress, but people generally are cool with FDR. And he actually pushed for the federal prosecution of peonage and the exploitation of the 13th Amendment loophole. Yes. So the idea is that peonage, just for anybody who isn't clear, would be the private act of doing exactly what the prison systems did. So if you had your belongings stolen by someone, for instance, and you caught them and then tried to prosecute them for stealing your stuff, if you got them to admit that they did this, you could just have them be your slave and work off their debt to you, essentially.
I'm sorry, that was allowed?
It wasn't not allowed.
Oh my god.
So, like, there was no legal precedent for it, but this was something that people were doing, right?
Oh my god, what the fuck?
It's great. Everything is fine. So FDR was like, no, that's not cool. And I just hit a bunch of hangers.
No, that's not cool.
It's not cool. So he pushed for the federal government to prosecute people who did this. So, but he also created something called the Federal Prison Industry, or FPI.
Man.
He, with an executive order, he created FPI, which is now known as Unicor. Do you know what that is?
That sounds super familiar. I'm pretty sure there's like John Oliver segments or like other segments exploiting them because they like overwork and underpay people. It's like a pay-to-play prison system, right? It's the
It
prison
is
for profit?
interesting. Yes,
Yeah.
it is. The entire mission statement of Unicor is to use prison inmates as labor to produce goods and services. That's it.
Wow, that's concise.
Yep.
I'll give it to the marketing team.
Yeah, it sums it up pretty good. It is with 0 qualifications, just a private corporation owned and operated entirely by the United States government. Period.
Great.
So once that was created, there was something called the Ashurst-Sumner Act, and that put restrictions in place to avoid interstate sales and market flooding, kind of like before. But the end result was still a labor force with no unionization, a base rate of pay of 23 cents an hour, and a maximum pay of $1.15 an hour. And actually, in this case, interstate sales were actually allowed now with prisoners who were on parole, prisoners who were on supervised release or probation, or who were in any penal or reformatory institution.
Do you have the numbers for how that pay compares to current pay?
I don't.
All right, so that's going to be a little splicey, but we paused and looked it up just to make sure. Brooke found a correction that's going to make you mad.
So I said that at the time that Unicor was created, which was at the time FPI, that there was a base rate of pay of 23 cents and a maximum pay of $1.15 an hour. I was incorrect. Those are numbers from today.
So to clarify, those are the numbers that people are being paid currently in like 2019-ish?
Yep. Well, I think this was
like
around
2019 values.
Right. This was 2016, I believe. So
okay.
It might be higher, it might be the same, but it's recent enough to know that it didn't change much. It's bad. It's bad.
Yeah, because I looked up a chart. So in the chart, it says in about 1938, which is a little bit after Unicor was created, minimum wage is 25 cents. So inmates were getting more than minimum wage. It's equivalent to $4.45 an hour. And if you're saying in 2016, they were making about 25 cents, that is what the minimum wage in 2016 was $7.25. So yeah, so that's like the bare fuck. Yeah, those were the numbers that made sense to me when I thought minimum wage, because I recall they're making that amount, and if I remember, and I don't know if you have the stat down, that's not money they're getting for themselves. The money goes almost immediately to pay off their sentence.
I'm sorry. Just wait. It's so much worse than that. It's not just... Okay, okay, yeah. Yes, you are correct. We will get into the insanity that is wages in the prison system, because I don't know if I mentioned this. They don't have to be paid. That's not something that they have to do. Unicor was created to sort of try and regulate it a little bit, but they don't have to. There's no legal precedent that says they have to be paid. They're not employees. And there is actually Supreme Court evidence that shows judges ruling that prisoners are not employees when working for the prison system.
That means no unionization, no protection, no benefits.
Oh yeah, no, like unions are not allowed.
No allowed. Well, unions aren't allowed generally.
Just
but
in general.
This and more in particular.
Right, so moving right along, I did want to nail in that last thing that I said, that interstate sales were not allowed except with prisoners who were on parole, on supervised release or probation, or in any penal or reformatory institution. Which, I'm sorry, that just sounds like everybody. That sounds like all of them. And if somebody knows legal stuff and wants to correct me, feel free, but this was the only way I could interpret it. I read it a bunch of different times from a bunch of different documents, and I have no idea how else to interpret it. It just seems like everybody can make stuff and then sell it across state lines. That's what it looks like.
Sick.
Also interesting to note that only 10% of eligible inmates are actually participating in Unicor labor. More on that later.
Great.
So here's a little pin that I'm going to put in the timeline here. We're going to jump to 1941. And now this other crazy thing happened in 1941. What was that called again? What was that?
World War II?
Yeah, that was it. That was it. World War II. That's right.
Boy.
So it was during this year that the Attorney General at the time, Francis Biddle, which is the worst name I've ever heard, he sent it to...
Casual roast. Do we like Biddle? All right,
no.
so fuck his name.
We don't like anybody.
Okay.
Just in general.
Yeah.
He sent a directive to all United States attorneys in regards to the handling of any cases about involuntary servitude or, essentially, modern prison slavery. So the directive basically said that anyone engaging in peonage or slavery in any sense of the word would get duly prosecuted. The directive seemed to be an attempt to get attorneys to try and actively take more slavery cases, and there was one reason for this. Do you think it was a moral reason, Olivia?
I think that they definitely took a turn, and they reflected in their gods, and they wanted to help others, and by your laughter, I'm guessing that's no.
Oh, you're so cute.
Oh.
So, the only reason they did this was because, World War II was happening, and the U.S. government was concerned that their new form of slavery could be used against them in anti-American propaganda overseas.
Oh no, just like how we only fixed poverty because we were worried that the communists would frame it as capitalism being unsuccessful. Listen to my previous episode if you'd like to hear more about that.
Yeah, that was the
sounds
only
like
reason
something we would do.
So they started trying more cases, and I also want to put another caveat on that. Attorneys were trying cases about peonage and slavery, but not necessarily the prison system. A lot of it was like individual instances of slavery. So, you know. And then it got worse. And then it got worse.
Oh boy.
The United States government installed what is known as Prison Industries Enhancement Programs.
Oh, I love big bureaucratic words that mean nothing. So
It
tell
just
me more.
doesn't mean shit, does it? Except it means exactly what it sounds like. So the Prison Industries Enhancement Program was completely exempt from the restrictions outlined in the Ashurst-Sumner Act, which, if you remember, was all the stuff that, restricted selling across state lines, etc., etc. So what this meant was, after an act called the Justice System Improvement Act, prison privatization was allowed, and those prisons could transport prison-made goods across state boundaries, period, with no restrictions. All of a sudden, profits from prison labor jumped from $392 million a year to $1.31 billion a year between 1980 and 1994.
Wow. Wow.
Can we just sit in this for a minute? Because when I read those numbers, I had to stand up and take a lap around the room.
Yikes.
I don't want to sound like a communist, but anything that makes your profit, a single entity company, makes your profit jump from what is already a triple digits million number to the billions is probably not ethical.
Woof, that a hot take.
It's a hot take, huh?
Man, both of these
Spicy.
episodes, we
I
just are
know.
left to ask the question, are we Karl Marx?
I think we might be a little bit Karl Marx.
Oh, whew. I
So
don't want to be Karl Marx.
I mean, there are issues with that, but I feel like I would rather be Karl Marx than these bullshit people.
You're not wrong.
So I looked at the Bureau of Justice Assistance website for the Prison Industries Enhancement Certification Program and found a lovely little pamphlet that outlines all the reasons why this is nothing but a good thing for both the inmates and the prisons alike.
Are there stock photos?
There are, yes. Actually, there are not only stock photos, but there are photos of the inmates at work, and I am completely convinced that these are just actors. They have to be. There's no way.
Yeah.
So on paper, they are very sneaky about making it look amazing. After all, it does say that wages can't be less than the industry standard for the same jobs, just private sector stuff. You need written assurance that the inmate's participation is voluntary. You need proof of consultation with private organizations of the same industry, and a whole bunch of authorities to give workers' comp and benefits. Now, notice how I said that they need the authority to give workers' comp and benefits, not proof that it happened.
Great.
So that's interesting. Also, I said before that they have to make the same as industry standard for the jobs that they're doing, as long as they're part of this program. The wages aren't real. More specifically, up to 80% of a worker's wages can be garnished by the corrections facility for various taxes, room and board, food, family support. At least 5% of their wages automatically has to go to the potential victims of their crimes. In fact, it's between at least 5% and up to 20% of their wages can go to the victims of their crimes. So let's do the math here, just for my sake. If a prison garnishes 80% of your wages while you work, let's say, a textile job that generously would pay $15 an hour, and let's be honest, they are absolutely maxing out on that percentage. They will take 80% if they can take 80%.
Yeah, 100%.
So by working 40 hours a week, which is conservative, honestly, I would imagine that they're working far more than that. But let's say you're working a normal 40-hour week. You are making about $520 a month, or $6,240 a year.
Okay.
This puts you at making right about $3 an hour.
Okay. Wow.
So all this shit that this pamphlet says that prisoners have to be paid a fair wage as per their industry is complete bullshit.
Yeah.
All of it. And at the bottom of the pamphlet, right at the bottom in this tiny text, it says, quote, "All departments of corrections and juvenile justice programs are eligible to apply for PIECP certification. This is labor that is not just put on adult inmates, but to children in juvenile detention centers as well."
No. Come on.
Yep. Yes. Yes.
Come on.
It is so much to take in, isn't it?
Why is it always the children?
It's always the kids, god damn it. It is always the kids. Now,
Okay.
I hear you saying, but Brooke, the site also says that the workers have to voluntarily participate. No one can force anyone to work, right? And you'd be right about that, except you're not at all. Psych, bitch, you'd think that you'd be used to this by now. First of all, the PIECP isn't a mandatory program. None of them are, so it doesn't apply to every prison in the U.S. Those guidelines are just for those prisons who want to be considered for the program. Other prisons, like, I don't know, maybe Holman Prison in Alabama, for instance, have...
Ooh, what a specific
It's
case.
very specific, isn't it? They have slightly different ways of doing business. After a massive lawsuit filed by the Southern Poverty Law Center, it came to light that Holman Prison, as well as a number of other prisons across the U.S., force their inmates to work in dangerous conditions with, quote, systemic mistreatment, as well as a crass disregard for human dignity.
Okay.
That's pretty scathing, in my opinion. So, I read an article by Kevin Rashid Johnson. He was the founder of the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee and the New African Black Panther Society. And he talked about his time in various prisons that he'd been transferred to during the life sentence that he is serving right now. He recalled that because he refused to work to what he rightly believes amounts to slavery, he has been in solitary confinement for all but 6 months since 1994. The article was written in 2018.
Oh my god, that gave me chills. Every time I think of solitary confinement, I think of the fact that I think it was in the U.S., started by Quaker Society.
Yeah.
And then they realized how unbelievably inhumane it was,
Yes.
and they stopped doing that. And then other prisons were like, wait a minute, that's a
Ooh.
great idea.
Inhumanity,
the amount
you
of
say?
psychological harm
Yes.
that comes from being alone just a day in solitary confinement, let alone like days, if not weeks at a time,
Right.
is insane.
And in where he was writing from, he was, to clarify, he was charged and convicted of murder, which he maintains that he was innocent of. I would tend to actually believe him, considering all of his work in the past. He created the New African Black Panther Society. That's enough to put a target on your back.
Oh, 100%.
I'm not going to say whether he's innocent or not, but it doesn't fucking matter, because what we're talking about right now is that he's been in solitary confinement for 25 years for refusing to work. 25 years. And because he continues to speak out against prison labor, he has been transferred, I think it was 5 times from prison to prison, and now he is in a cell block on death row, even though he is not a death row inmate. That is highly irregular.
Oh my god.
So he's in solitary for 25 years, and he, I think, has the authority to say that with few exceptions, if you don't work in prison, you get sent to solitary, and that's just the way it is. Even if they're part of the PIECP, all they have to do is threaten solitary confinement, and they get that written permission right away. And if they aren't part of
man.
PIECP, they can just do whatever the hell they want.
Oh man.
Yeah. Chain gangs still exist, and I think that's something that people don't know. I'm just going to go into this article that he wrote. It outlines some of the things he said. He said he's seen inmates forced to grow food in Texas and Florida, and that they tend the field with wooden sticks and roughly made gardening tools, and that guards on horseback with shotguns still patrol the fields. He talked about having to help inmates fill out wrongful death lawsuits for other inmates who were killed by guards during working hours. He talks about, yeah, buddy, it's not good, my dude. He talked about guards beating prisoners, destroying their property, and starving them. This doesn't even have anything to do with work. That's just treatment, period. He said something about how a lot of the, well, not a lot, but a portion of the guards that he was aware of and had interacted with in prison were found to be card-carrying KKK members. Which I feel like...
Sorry?
Yeah, I feel like that
those exist still?
You didn't know that?
I can't, like, oh my god. If you are, like, a card-carrying KKK member, you're absolutely not keeping that on the wraps. And so, the part that makes me angriest about this is not, like, a circumstance that they've been hired into these prison systems.
Yeah.
Like, if there are, like, regular and multiple card-carrying KKK members, the amount of, the institutional racism to the degree where they're, like, the people are actively hiring known KKK members just speaks of the volume of racism in the system.
Dude, white supremacists have been infiltrating the police for decades, but we don't have the time.
That's a whole nother fucking series.
It sure is.
If there's multiple in one prison, I can't even begin to fathom how much abuse occurs in that prison.
Oh, yeah. And these are, like, max security, so you just don't ever hear about it. They don't have to... prisons don't have to tell you anything, and I'll say more about this later, but, like, it's so difficult to get information because prisons don't have to release anything that happens at all.
Also, if you are an inmate and you complain ever, it seems to me that you get put in solitary confinement.
That would be a correct assessment of the situation, yes.
So, it's, okay.
Yeah.
Just continue on, please.
So those were the things that he said about his experiences. And then, just recently, even last year, we saw prisoners being put on the front lines to fight California's wildfires for a whopping $1 per hour. Now,
question, do you have any info on this? Were they trained in the slightest? Because I do remember that.
I believe that they were given minimal training, but I don't know. It's impossible that they could have been trained to the degree that they needed to be.
Yeah,
like,
because that's years of training.
Well, it's years of training, and also... So, the state claims that the reason why they did this was to build firefighting skills for when they're released from prison. But pretty much all firefighter positions require EMT training, which convicts are prohibited from taking. So, no, that's not...
Wait. Oh my god, we don't have time to unpack that fact.
Yes, I know, it's insane. It's just... And that's the other thing, is that, like, I don't know if our listeners all have jobs. Perhaps you do. I would assume that if you did have a job, you would have noticed this little portion of your application that says, have you ever been convicted of a crime? Yeah. And it is illegal for employers to discriminate based on race, gender, sexuality, etc., etc. It is not illegal for them to discriminate based on whether or not you have ever been a convict. So, all this shit about, well, the jobs they're doing they're helping them gain skills for the workforce. These people aren't getting factory jobs because they can't fucking find work. No one will hire them.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. So in response to all of this, in 2018, an inmate strike in prisons across 17 states.
I remember this.
Yes. Thousands of workers systematically refused to go to work. Some of them, they went on hunger strikes. Some of them boycotted the commissary so that the prison couldn't make money off of them. Because, oh right, they have to work for wages and then pay for their meals. Interesting. They demanded fair pay, first of all, humane living conditions, and the access to education and rehabilitation programs. Those were their general 3 demands. There wasn't like an overarching, like, this is all of us, we all want the same thing. Each prison kind of got to determine what their demands were. But those were the 3 that, like, most of them wanted. One anonymous inmate, she didn't want to give her name out because she was afraid that she would be punished if she did. But she talked about how she had seen inmates get disciplinary infractions for missing work when violently ill, but that the 13th Amendment protected the prisons from facing any legal action because they are not technically employees. I don't have a good ending for you. The strike happened.
when your strike ends, I would like to share some news to tell you it gets worse.
Oh, good. I love that. The end of the strike story is just that it happened. Most of the states where they happened claim, if they responded at all, that they can't afford to pay inmates more because of the volume of prisoners. But somehow, I feel like if nonviolent criminals were rehabilitated and released, if black people weren't incarcerated at rates 5 times higher than that of white people, then perhaps we wouldn't have that problem. And I'm not just blowing smoke up your ass. I am saying that with statistics. The NAACP once calculated that if people of color in general were convicted and imprisoned at the same rate as white people, the jail and prison population would decrease by as much as 40%. Whether we like it or not, the prison system as we know it today was founded on an attempt to reinstate what the South felt like it was owed to them. The sole intention of most of the earliest iterations of the prison system that we know today, the entire criminal justice system, was meant to re-enslave black people, and it would just be naive to pretend that those origins don't still hold true today. For over 100 years, we never saw any sort of human rights amendments made to the way prisoners were run because the only priority was profit. That's it.
Hey, boy. All right. Would you like to hear something that makes it worse?
But of course, I mean, why are we here?
So, you motherfucker took the rug out from under me of what I was going to do in the following series.
Yeah.
But I'd rather use the information to, further add to this episode than make it a separate one.
Oh, yeah, spoiler alert. We're doing prisons for our next series.
Yeah, I was like, you said it, and I was like, you motherfucker, you.
I couldn't not do it. Once I started digging into it, it's insane. The level
it is
of,
insane.
oh my god. It's
literal slavery.
It's just fucking slavery. I'm so angry. Go on.
So when I was in my neoliberalism course, we did 2 weeks on debtors' prisons. And if you really want to read the most in-depth synopsis of it, the ACLU recently did a report on debtors' prisons with just horrific personal accounts of what it's like. Essentially, the court system has been set up where it is requiring funding from the prosecution of criminals. So essentially when you get prosecuted, there's fees you pay to the court that goes to sustaining the court. So as a result, if you have courts that are in poorer areas, they're entirely dependent upon high rates of prosecution because they need those fees. So what would happen is they would pick people up for the most minor infractions like parking tickets or missing 3 months of rent because they are poor. And then sentencing them to jail. And like you said previously, when you get sentenced to jail, you have to pay the legal fees. You have to pay the court fees. You have to miss work and potentially and almost guaranteed lose your job. And then you have to pay to be in prison. So people exit prison for missing their rent because they couldn't pay their rent because they're poor with debts on them.
Right, and when they get out, they've been evicted.
Right? They've been evicted, they've lost their job. So, there's accounts of people who are I've been homeless for 2 years. I work a 9-to-5 job and I'm homeless because all of my money has to go to paying my debt off because it's not a huge debt, but the interest accrues for people who can't afford to pay it. And then if the interest accrues enough or you miss enough payments, then you have to go back to jail and pay more debtors' fees for the court and for the legal prosecution and to be in jail. So it's this circular loop of if you can't afford to pay, we're going to imprison you for not being able to pay, and then upon your exit, you're going to have to pay more for both the time you've spent in jail, but the interest that's accrued over the existing debt that continued to accrue while you were in jail and physically incapable of paying, right?
It's just a loop.
So in this report, that's part of the reason that the black population is far more incarcerated, barring all the drug-related stuff for minor non-violent related offenses, is there's thousands of people in the U.S. that are being imprisoned for being poor. That's what that is. Like,
Just-
I don't care to hear the argument of like, well, you know, if they pay the thing on time, then they got
fuck you.
arrested
Yeah,
in the
no.
first place for being poor, and now they're more poor. And there was a woman interviewed. She said, I'd been arrested for drug-related offenses, and I've rehabilitated. I work a rehabilitation clinic in my community. She's a pillar of the community. It's been 30 years since she's been arrested, and she has like $15,000 in debt of like accrued interest and other legal fees. And so even though it's been years since she's been arrested, she has no violent offenses. She has no criminal history of 15 years. She has children. Like, they rearrested her for not paying her bills on time because she can't afford to pay her bills. So it's like and that's what's so important is I know the argument of like, well, these are prisoners, these are people that have committed crimes. If they've committed crimes, then they shouldn't be allowed to vote. Inmates, anybody who's been like arrested, I think if it's a felonious crime, I know for sure, you're not allowed to apply for federal aid to go to school. You're barred from that, which means that you can't get an education, because I highly doubt these people can afford to get an education as it is.
Yeah, no.
You know, and then on top of that, you're essentially pigeonholed into working, which goes back to the prison and not your debts that you're accruing while you're there. So it's one of those things that's the debtor's prison made me so sad, because they're literally criminalizing poverty.
Yes.
And then adding to a population of people that are legal slaves.
Right, yeah.
And then exiting these prisons with debts that they cannot pay, and absolutely no means of escaping the loop of poverty, because they can't afford school, because they don't have the money, they don't have the time. They're working 40 to 60-hour weeks at bare minimum wage.
Yes.
A lot of that money going to child support, going to rent and utilities, and then also their debt from being in prison. Like, it could be a whole fucking episode talking about poverty in the U.S.
Right.
But once you're poor, it's like
That's
you're
it.
poor for life.
Yeah, that's it.
If you've been arrested, you're definitely going to be poor, because you can't apply to federal aid to go to school, and any means of raising yourself out of poverty is barred to you.
Right. And it's not just, oh, you got unlucky that you're poor. The court system is incentivized to systematically disenfranchise and then re-disenfranchise people for being poor. They make their money based on the volume of people they bring in, so they just bring in everybody.
And then the amount of like personal accounts in that ACLU document where they were like, in order to meet these payments, I had to start selling drugs again, which I didn't want to do. And then they're arrested for those drug offenses and more money debted. And it's horrible. It's a horrible system. And I implore anybody who thinks and justifies that this is fine because they're criminals and they've like broken the law, what would you like them to do? Because in my ideal world, I would like a prison to be somewhere where you've reformed someone and they return to society with avenues to improve themselves and have, you know, no desire to do these things that are going to put them back into prison.
Right.
Like, no necessity to do illegal things to avoid prison, right?
Yes, yeah.
I would like that to be the case, but that's clearly, if the episode has demonstrated, that's clearly not it.
Yeah.
These are not institutions to reform. These are institutions that both contribute to and depend on the high recidivism rates in the U.S.
Yeah.
And that's what keeps me up at night, because once you've been arrested once, that's it. Like, you're stuck in that. It reminds me of my favorite Kafka novel.
Oh.
What is it? It's The Trial, and he goes to a lawyer, and the premise of the novel is he gets arrested and nobody ever tells him what he's being arrested for, and the lawyer says you don't find out what you're being arrested for until you go to trial, and he's not allowed to defend himself at his own trial. He needs to get a lawyer to defend himself, and he says, okay, well, am I going to be free? And he's like, well, no. What you're going to do is you're going to do a system of appeals where you keep going to trial, but then not get convicted. That's your best case scenario, is that you just never go to jail. And he's like, okay, but I don't want to be arrested. I don't want to be convicted. I want to be, like, confirmed to be innocent. And the lawyer's like, no, you don't do that. Best case scenario is you just continue to go through this loop forever so that you don't get arrested. Which is soberingly what this is.
Yeah, it's...
Kafka is my main man, and he fucking gets it.
Yeah, he did not do so good in his brain.
No, every time he finished a novel, he committed himself to an insane asylum. So...
Oh, Kafka, whoa, buddy.
Is he wrong?
No.
No.
Oh, God, no.
And every trial that he goes to, he just waits in a line forever and then is not told what you never find out what he's arrested for. And
I hate it.
But it's such a good novel. It's so good. And that's what this is. That's what keeps me up about it. The fact that there's nothing we can do about it, really.
Yeah.
There's nothing they can do about it, really. And I can't... One of the best things about this podcast is that I've become far more empathetic than I've ever been.
Yeah.
Just hearing these stories and hearing personal accounts. And one of the negatives is that it is incredibly, and I don't know if you feel the same thing, it's incredibly difficult for me to have conversations with people about topics like this because I just can't help but feel just disheartened by the sheer lack of human empathy.
Yeah, I don't
discourse.
know. I don't know how to tell people that they should care about other human beings. Like, I don't know how to argue that because I feel like I shouldn't have to. It's this crazy thing where, it was like what I was saying before. There was this argument that I saw on Twitter where someone was like, people who are in prison should be able to vote. And someone was like, but they'll just vote themselves out of prison. And then they were faced with the fact that they don't have the numbers to do that. And their response was, well, then they'll just vote harsher and harsher prison laws until there's enough of them to vote themselves all out of prison. And it's not about logic. It's just about I need to hate someone, right? Like,
and that's what it is too. Like when I got into the argument with somebody the other day, I could not help but feel empathy both towards people involved in the fire festival, which we've done a discussion on that, on how we've discussed when you're in that environment, human beings are so ready to just radically accept, like, everything's going to be okay. I just have to keep working and everything's going to work out and it's going to be fine. Right? Like, I couldn't help but feel empathy towards not the owner of Fire Festival. He can go fuck right off.
Fuck that guy.
But, the employees that were told repeatedly, it's going to be fine. Everything's going to be okay. You just need to keep working. You're not going to get half of your salary until this is finished. I couldn't help but feel bad for flat earthers who clearly feel a sense of belonging in this community that they feel nowhere else. And when I got into this argument with someone, anytime I ever offered any form of human empathy towards these people that I think are commonly seen to be objectively stupid or bad, she just got angry and changed the subject. And I was like, I don't know where to navigate this.
What do I tell you?
Like, at the end of the day, like, you can't make me hate them. And that frustrated her. And she said, I feel like it takes away blame to, like, feel bad for them and, like, not hold them accountable. And I'm like, they're still accountable for their actions, but you can hate the actions and not the actor. You can say they did shitty things, but still feel empathy. And I feel like it just becomes this conversation of, I don't want to hear you out. I want you to agree with me. And if you don't hate the same people I hate, you're a bad person. And I'm like,
internet discourse.
And it just makes me sad. And I hope this episode imparts with you just a bit of, like, even if somebody did a crime, whether they were framed for it, whether they actually did it, whether they were a victim of circumstance, no matter what it is, they don't deserve this, dude.
No one does. And if you were imprisoned for anything, and by the way, I do want to make it painfully clear that many of the people who are arrested and convicted are completely innocent.
Yeah.
We didn't even talk about the fact that people take plea bargains and go to prison because they were wrongfully accused of something that they didn't do. And the best case scenario is to take a plea deal because if they are, God forbid, convicted and found guilty, they just go to jail forever, and taking a couple years is a better scenario.
Which is so Kafkaesque. That's exactly what the whole fucking book about is. He says, I've done nothing wrong. I don't want to be arrested. I want to be proven innocent. And he said, we don't do that here. Best case scenario, I continue to go to court for you for years, or you just like accept partial blame and then hope that you never get arrested for it.
And so I just want you to imagine for a moment that you're picked up off the street for doing absolutely nothing wrong, and suddenly you are flung into this system and you're completely innocent. How the fuck would you feel if suddenly you were being forced to do slave labor and you were put into this system where you can't get out? Even when you're released, you can't get out. This is wrong. It's just wrong. Period. And like I said, I don't know how to convince people that they should give a shit about other people, but just, if all else fails, how would you feel if this happened to you?
Yeah.
And I think the thing that keeps me up at night is the fact that in all of my public and higher education, at no point was I ever told that the 13th Amendment explicitly allows for slavery. Up through high school, I'm pretty sure that I was just never told that that the U.S. sanctions slavery if you get sent to prison. It's like an open secret. It's not hidden by any means. It's just sort of on the page. But nobody wants you looking too closely at it, right?
Yeah.
And it was painted for me, at least, like the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, the end. And that's just not the case. Slavery was never abolished. It just was made a little bit more complicated.
Yeah.
So this was a bummer.
Yeah, this was a hell of a bummer. But I'm sure it leaves a little bit of intrigue on what we will be covering for our next series on prisons.
Oh, yes.
This was a sad one. It's just like, and it's so interconnected, and I think, unfortunately, because Hassan is going to be guesting for our final episode, and I'm nervous.
Yeah.
But I guess this whole series is it begins, there's always a takeaway from the series of the core root of the issue, the similarity in all of them. And I guess the similarity in this series, and I hope this is not what it is, but it's going to be what it is that just there's populations of people that nobody cares about.
Yeah. And that's been all of our series so far. It has been sort of this running thread of, if we just cared about these people, none of this would have happened.
Yeah. And it's nobody cares, not nobody, but like a large portion of people have been led to believe that just because you break a law, you deserve this.
God, I just don't understand that.
Horrible. And then a large majority of people believe that like sweatshops are the best case scenario, which is even hard for me to argue because I hate the alternative.
Right.
Like,
it's all bad.
And I just don't want to believe that policies have been made and there's root beliefs that are just built upon people not caring about other people. And that's the feeling that I'm leaving this episode with.
Which isn't a great feeling.
If you feel like people don't care about other people, you should definitely care about us and leave us a review on iTunes.
Yikes, Olivia. Oh my God.
How did you want me to end this?
That was terrible. I do actually have one more thing.
I want you to tell me how you want me to transition to our social media after this.
I have one
Do you want to take responsibility? Go ahead, Brooke.
Fine.
Go. Transition to it.
Well, I will then. I do want to give a special thanks to a few organizations. The NAACP, obviously, the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee, EndSlaveryNow.org. Also, Kevin Rashid Johnson, whose article was instrumental in me understanding sort of the scope of what was going on. All of the information I got on all of this was entirely thanks to those four, because it's so difficult to get information about this stuff. Like I said before, there's no accountability to what happens in prison. They don't have to report anything. Like when the strikes happened, they just claimed it never happened. That They just said, no, there was no strike. What are you talking about? And they're allowed to do that. So for these organizations to do the legwork and then publish it so that there's information, if you feel so inclined, I highly recommend donating whatever you can to these organizations, because they're the only thing opening the door that the entire U.S. government is leaning against. So that is that. And on that note, we do interact on social media. If you've listened before, you already know all this stuff. But if you're new, hi, welcome. We adore you. We're on Twitter and Instagram at TTKMeUp. If you want to shoot us a message and tell us how sad we made you this week, that's totally fair. We are also sad. If you leave us a review on iTunes and let us know what you think, that makes our day, unless it's negative, which will hurt my feelings. And
crush me instrumentally.
We did get another review, so we're flying high at 24. And we do have a website, ttkmeup.com, that has all the links to stuff about us. Our Patreon is on there as well. All of the links to where you can find us on Podbean, iTunes, Stitcher, etc., wherever you find your podcasts. And I think that'll do it. Thank you for continuing to listen to us. It feels nice to yell for an hour.
Retweet my memes. I post good memes.
She did post a fire one this week, I gotta say.
But yeah, this was a good episode. Congratulations, Brooke. Well done.
Thank you. I'm
on
sad.
That note, nothing positive to end on?
Actually, yes, there is. Our next mini-sode, I believe, is going... Olivia and I talked, and we realized that we're just kind of sad now. So we decided that we're going to start a tradition. We're going to start doing one mini-sode every now and then. It's just going to be us talking about positive shit.
Yeah.
You won't know when it's happening, but it'll happen. And it'll be just when we decide we need it. And I think this next mini-sode is when we have decided that we need it. So that is our...
Also, I would like it to get to a point if we're, like, into a series and we just get a shitload of tweets that are like, give us the positive mini-sode. Yeah, bitch, same.
Yeah,
so
we're feeling it, so...
It'll be a good mini-sode, and I think we're definitely going to need it after this episode.
Yes.
So,
I
love you all.
So tired. I love
You're
you.
angels. I guess it's been real.
See us.
Bye.
What a van, what a van, what a van, what a mighty good van sales. Can I help you?
Yes, we're looking for a van.
Any special features?
Child locks.
We don't want to lose anyone.
No windows.
That's for privacy.
And no carpet or seats.
We want to be able to hose it out.
Roomy.
There's going to be a lot of moving around in there.
All right, what's this van going to be used for, ladies?
Like everybody else, we're doing a podcast. I'm Jennifer Sandwich.
I'm Mel's Bells.
And I'm a not culpable Acadia Einstein.
We're the hosts of Yikes, Murder and Stuff, a not safe for work podcast where every week we'll bring you stories of true murder, international crimes, and abnormal psychology.
If that sounds like something you're into, then put your headphones on and hop in our nondescript windowless van and come see the puppies. YikesMurderAndStuff.com or wherever you listen to podcasts.
And it's safe for work if you work at a construction site.
Oh, God.